chronicle of those first 9 friars who came here 150 years ago to the day. It's written, "Our hearts beat high as we beheld the shores of the New World. We entered the harbor of New York on the 14th of September, and it was a fairy-like spectacle to behold a metropolis in a flood of light. We arrived on the feast of the exaltation of the Holy Cross. Was this to be for us a sign from heaven that we must prepare for the cross and then embrace it manfully? Perhaps it was, for the life's path of a friar in America is frequently hedged in with crosses. Not tarrying in New York, we already on the next day boarded an immigrant train that was to bring us to Illinois." If you work with primary sources, David, Michael, you know that, of course, you can glean things from them. Even these few words tell us that these friars came from the province of the Holy Cross in Germany, and they knew that the Feast of the Exaltation of the Cross had a special meaning for them at this moment. They were facing the unknown, but they seemed to know something about what it was like to be a friar in the U.S. It'd be fascinating to know just what they thought they were getting into, because I'm sure some of it was proved true and some of it was not. And they joined other immigrants on the train. And what's not mentioned, but is known, is that the habits that they'd been wearing on the crossing on the ship, they traded for secular garments for their trip to Illinois on the train. All very interesting little vignettes, and probably more so. I'm Ken, this is John, Ralph, and John. The 4 of us are here representing, in the best way we can, my classmate, Lawrence Jagfeld. Lawrence is working on the history of the province, and has been for some years now. And he certainly wanted to be here to do this presentation. Right now, his health situation is such that he needs to be managed with some physical therapy. He's got a herniated disc and some other issues that he's working through. So he regrets not being here as much as we regret his not joining us. He would have given you much more of his own work than I'm capable of actually doing. We're here marking 150 years of Franciscan presence in the Midwest, here in the U.S., and as I was saying, you know, to my mentor, Dave Costigan, who's there, a U.S. historian, this is not my Fach, as the Germans would say. This is not my area. I'm a 14th century sort of a guy, so I'm about 500 years off the mark here. But all of us have varying degrees of familiarity with these experiences for the last 150 years. And last night, many of us had a chance to get up to speed with just the introductions that were made about our province and our friars' arrival here. So I'm not going to retell that story or make this a kind of traditional narrative. What we've tried to put together for us today with the help of our brothers here is that we would create more of an overview of this experience of the last 150 years to get a sense of maybe where we've come from and where we may be going, and also to involve them, particularly since they, unlike myself, have all taught the history of our Franciscan presence in the Midwest. They've all taught the history of our province in initial formation. So we want their wisdom, such as it is. And I do want to encourage you to realize some things about them. Ralph Carthy came to me at the time he was asked to teach history of the province in the novitiate, and my response was,
"You don't have a historical bone in your body."
I couldn't believe they'd asked him to do it, but I did give you some advice. Do you remember that advice? I think it might be helpful.
To teach the history of the province in the context of the history of the church.
And of the entire experience of the United States, so that we weren't separated out as some small homegrown reality. But the push factors in the wider society have always affected the life of the church and the order, and that would be true here. And I think you know it's a mutual thing that occurs. John Doctor, our former provincial minister, is here. He certainly taught the history of the province, and here we are working together again. And John Dabrowski has done the same, taught the history of the province. I should tell you that John and I are the charter members of the support group of those who have worked with John Doctor and survived. One of John's many accomplishments. So we've set up the context a little bit. Let me just say something interesting. Benedictine sister Joan Chittister, I believe, Benedictine sister, did a history of her congregation not too long ago in this decade. And I'm stealing from her because she did something very inventive, I think, that I like, and that's chopping up history into periods of time, which is not supposed to be just arbitrary, Michael, right? There's usually a reason for it. The reason being that something happens that's distinctive, that's noticeable about those periods. And just for the sake of making it neat and clean, imagine our past 150 years as 3 blocks of 50 years each, roughly. Those first 50 years we would describe as origins, how we got started. Those next 50 years would be a period of really intense expansion and development. And those third 50 years that some of us are more directly involved in, say from the 1950s and the 60s to the present, would be a period of many things, but certainly retrieval, renewal, and new life. Or as Francis would say, as we were noticing in the readings just last evening, holy newness. Imagine Francis himself talking about each of those 3 blocks of time. In those first 50 years, I'm sure he would tell us first friars lived the gospel. In those second 50 years, along with the rest of an immigrant church here in the U.S., served the church. What would he say to us now, as we've been singing, as we did last night repeatedly, let us begin? That's, I think, where we find ourselves. Just as our brother Jose made it clear, all of this celebration of these 150 years has got to be future-oriented, future-directed. Otherwise, we're just antique collectors. We really need to make this history something that propels us to where we need to be. Let's look at origins. Those first 50 years. The amazing response of those first friars. The first 9 came, and they all had their specific roles to play. You had a carpenter, and you had a gardener, and you had someone who was going to cook, and you had a moral theologian. You had men who represented a European province that in essence didn't do parish work, did preaching ministry and education. Now they brought those skills with them. From day one they adapted. They were working with German-speaking immigrants who needed pastoral ministry, so they made that happen. But a mere 2 years after they were here, what do? Not surprisingly, they found a school in Quincy, which has been part of my own life for some decades and certainly the lives of a number of us. This is a small foundation in its first years. Then, in this period of origins, what happens? A completely repressive state takes over in such a way that religious orders are suppressed and members are basically disbanded. The blessing for the mission here in the United States is that our numbers swelled in the 1870s just enormously. Something like 100 friars joined this fledgling mission. And in a matter of a few years after that, in 1879, we're not a mission or a commissariat any longer, we're a province. And that's an astonishing growth spurt. And we'll look at that again because I think it's constitutive of who we are.